John chapter 11, verse 1. Now a man named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same Mary who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, Lord, the one you love is sick. Skip to verse 5. Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. Now skip down to verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Verse 22, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was come into the world. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him, he asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied, and Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. Then the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the Sanhedrin. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. So a lot of things I want to unpack in there, but the first one is that I want you to notice is this. Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. There's no doubt how much Jesus loved them, but it was such that John felt the need to even express it. Jesus had a special relationship with this family. They were his friends, and he dearly loved them. And so when his friend Lazarus became ill and his sisters sent for Jesus, I'm sure in their hearts they thought, Jesus surely will come. And they had faith in Jesus. They had seen Jesus make the blind man see. They had seen Jesus heal people on the verge of death. They had even, prior to this, seen people raise the dead. And so they knew that Jesus could come and make everything better. But when Jesus got word that his friend Lazarus lay sick and probably dying, Jesus chose to stay where he was. Now, part of the narrative that I skipped is the discourse between Jesus and his disciples. And Jesus tells his disciples after he gets word that, or knows that Lazarus is dead, we must go now. Our friend Lazarus is dead. And he said, I'm glad I was not there for your sake. I'm glad I wasn't there to keep him from dying for your sake, so that you might believe. So the thing that I want you to notice, or one of the things, is this. Loving someone doesn't mean you always give them what they want. Now, as a parent, hopefully you know this. If you don't, it's your kids that the teachers don't like and everybody else's parent talks about as being one who's spoiled and out of control. Just because you love somebody doesn't mean you give them everything that they want, but it does mean that you always act in their best interest. Now, I'm sure that the disciples could not have imagined how Jesus not preventing his own friend from dying was in their interest. That they could believe not only that Jesus was the prophet come from God, not only that Jesus was this promised Messiah, not only that Jesus was from God, but that Jesus, in fact, was God. He had power over death, not just to keep a sick man from dying, but to bring a dead man back from death. When Lazarus got sick, Mary and Martha did what they should have done. They sent for Jesus. They prayed. They may not have realized it and thought of it as praying, but if you're speaking to God and you're not Him, that's what you're doing. And so they did what we should do when we come to places of difficulty and places of trial and places of trouble. That is, we pray. Peter tells us to cast all our cares on Him, for He cares for you. And James tells us that we have not because we ask not. A great old hymn tells us to tell it to Jesus. And so they did what they should have done. And Jesus got their message. He heard their prayer, but He did not give them the answer that they wanted. See, Jesus revealed that what would come of this situation that He was allowing to happen would bring glory to the Son of God. Now this one, I told you last week I was being honest and transparent, and so I'll do the same now. That's difficult for me. It's difficult for me when God allows me to go through things that I don't like, or things that are painful, things that are traumatic or cause me suffering. I don't like it that God allows me to go through those things, but He allows me to go through those things, one, because it's ultimately for my good, and two, something in that situation is going to bring Him glory, and it's all about Him. And the bottom line is, I call Him Lord, which, remember, in the Greek means master. It's what a slave called his owner. Well, is He my Lord or not? Is He my master or not? Does He have every right to everything about me or not? And if He does, then I have to trust Him. So Jesus got their message, and He revealed that what would come of this situation would bring glory to the Son of God. Jesus knows the end from the beginning. I barely know right now from just a second ago. Jesus knows the very end of all things from the very beginning of all things. So the bottom line comes down to this. Do I trust Him to do what is always right or not? You know, when you enter into a relationship with God, you do it by trusting Him. You say, Lord, I trust You. I trust You to save me from my sin. I trust You that You have taken care of death and the penalty of sin, and that I'm going to go to heaven when I leave this world, either because You come back and get me or because I die and join You. So I trust You for that. But do I trust You to handle my day-to-day life? Do I trust You that even though what's happening I don't understand and I don't like and it's quite painful, that You know what You're doing? Do I trust Him to do what is always right or not? Job said it this way when his friends confronted him and about all the things that God allowed to happen to him. Job said this, will not the judge of all the earth do what is right? Martha showed great faith in Jesus, but her faith was incomplete, as her discourse with Jesus shows. And Mary too. I skipped Mary's discourse with Jesus because it was very similar to Martha's. They could not yet understand that Jesus not only was from God, but that He was God. He not only had power over sickness and disease, but even over life and death. It's unfortunate for us as human beings, but it's just simply the way that it is. Some things we can only learn by experiencing. You know, I've often said that any idiot can learn from his own mistakes, or at least we ought to be able to. You ought not to make the same mistake over and over again. At some point, you know, even a dog learns not to touch something because it shocks him, right? Sometimes we're a little slower than our furry friends, but at some point we ought to learn not to do something because of the ramifications of us doing that. And wisdom ought to be that we can learn vicariously from someone else. You know what? We observe in someone else's life, oh, you know what? Well, they messed up here, and I see the mistakes they made, so I'm not going to make those same mistakes. And we ought to, most things in life, be able to learn that way. But there are some lessons, there are some things that we truly can only know because we've experienced them. And apparently, one of those was fully grasping who Jesus was and who Jesus is. But you know, it really does make sense because they knew Jesus. Jesus lived in their village, and some of them may have even known Jesus as a child. And so it was difficult for them to grasp. His own brothers, no one in his own family, believed in him until after the resurrection. But in all honesty, who couldn't believe in him after the resurrection? When you see a man tortured to death, as many criminals in the Roman Empire were, and then buried for 3 days, and then see him alive again, it changed even his own brothers, so that his own brothers believed in him. And 2 of them wrote books in the New Testament. But Mary and Martha, they had great faith in Jesus, and they believed that Jesus was from God. They believed he was the prophet that Moses had spoken about. They believed he was the promised Messiah, but they hadn't yet quite grasped who he was. But this would do it. Martha and Mary both had far-away faith in Jesus to bring their brother back at the resurrection at the end of the age, but they did not fully understand yet who it was who was standing among them. Jesus asked it of Peter this way, "Who do men say that I am?" And Peter and the other disciples said, "Well, some say that you're John the Baptist resurrected, or John the Baptist, or Elijah, or some great prophet, or a great teacher." And Jesus looked at them and said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." It was a great confession. And so Jesus was about to demonstrate to Mary and to Martha and to his disciples and to all those around them what it means, great I am. Jesus identifies himself as the resurrection and the source of life itself. Now, let me ask you this, because in the narrative, you see, and you know the shortest verse in all the Bible, verse 35 there, Jesus wept. And it says that Jesus was troubled, moved and troubled. Well, why was Jesus moved and troubled? Well, the crowd thought it was because he loved Lazarus, and he was distraught because Lazarus had died. I don't think that was it. I mean, 1, Jesus knew who he was, and 2, he knew what he was about to do. So I don't think that was the source of Jesus weeping. I think that Jesus was moved and troubled at the mourners. I mean, these people were just, well, some of them were just, and you know these people. Have you ever noticed, and it's not as bad here, I've noticed it in some outlying counties when I go to funeral homes when there are visitations. There are some people that is their social life. You know, they come to the funeral home and visitations at the funeral home, and they sit there in the chair the entire time. I'm not talking about family. I'm talking about people not related. And they're just visiting with everybody that comes. It's just their social life. And they're professional mourners, you know. They just go around to when somebody they know died, and they just go and sit and talk to everybody that they haven't seen in a while. I don't guess there's anything wrong with that. But some of these were professional mourners that were with Martha and Mary, and you know, and every time one of them moved, they would all follow her. Suppose, whoa, she's moving. It must be we need to go with her. Surely it couldn't be that she needs to get away from you. But anyway, so, you know, Mary runs out. She hears that Jesus is there, and she runs out to where Jesus is. And they get up and they follow her, and it says Jesus is moved and troubled. I think part of that is at the mourners. One, at the spectacle that's going on, but primarily just at death itself. Not that God is overwhelmed by death as we are, but simply that death exists at all. It wasn't part of God's original design for you and me to die. That came about as a result of rebellion. That came about as a result of disobeying Him. The wages of sin is disobeying God, is death. So it is the natural course of things, because sin is the natural course of things, because that's what we chose to do. And so I think Jesus is moved and troubled at the mourners, at the effects of sin. But you know the primary reason that I think Jesus is moved and troubled? Because no one really understood who he was. Here was the one who spoke and the heavens came into being. The one who spoke and the earth was formed. The one who spoke and there was light. The one who spoke and there was life on the planet and in the air and under the sea. And the one who reached down and from the dust of the earth formed man and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And they didn't recognize him. They didn't know him for who he was. And so I think Jesus was moved and troubled for all of these things. Why did God? He was also man. He shares in our humanity, and so I think it was genuine empathy. If any of you ever, and some more than others, if any of you ever, watched something, a movie or a television show, and been moved to tears by what you're watching because it's just moving, well, that's good. That means, one, that you're not a sociopath. That you're able to empathize with your fellow human being. That's what a sociopath is, someone who has no empathy at all. And these are dangerous individuals. But the fact that you are able to weep at someone else's story shows that you are able to empathize with them. Jesus shared in our humanity, and I think Jesus wept because of empathy. I think he wept because of their blindness and their hardness of heart. And I think he wept for what lay ahead. Not immediately what lay ahead, but what lay ahead down the road. The hard road that was going to come for them after he was gone. So these are the reasons that I think Jesus wept. Now notice when Jesus is at the tomb, when he tells them to move the stone, and of course they object at first because, Lord, it's going to stink. He's dead. They didn't embalm them. They just simply washed them, wrapped them, and stored them. And so Martha objects and said, Lord, it's going to stink in there. But they finally moved the stone at Jesus' command. And then Jesus looks up to heaven and he says, Father, thank you for hearing me, for what you're about to do. And he says, I'm just saying this for their sake, so they'll know that you hear me. And then he commands in a loud voice, Lazarus, come forth. So he called Lazarus by name. Number one, Jesus knew Lazarus. You know who else Jesus knows? He knows me. He knows my name. He knows your name. And one day Jesus will call my name. He'll call me by name. Jesus knew Lazarus. But you know why else I think Jesus called Lazarus by name? There would have been a whole lot of dead folks coming out of the tomb if Jesus had simply said, come forth. He was specific in who he raised. And he said, Lazarus, come forth. So Lazarus came out of the tomb. Jesus has won the victory over death, over the grave, and even over hell. And one day, the resurrection that Martha spoke of, that she thought Jesus was referring to, that resurrection of the saints at Jesus' return will be infinitely more glorious than Lazarus' resurrection was, for two reasons. One, because all the saints of all time will rise to meet him in the air. But two, because that resurrection will be raised to our new glorious body. That resurrection will be raised never to die. That resurrection will be raised never to experience the pain of sin and sorrow that is so prevalent in this world. Lazarus was raised in the same old body he went in. Lazarus was raised to have to die a second time. So that resurrection will be infinitely more glorious. Now, what I find most interesting in all of this is the reaction of the people after Jesus had raised Lazarus. In verse 43, when he had said this, Lazarus come forth, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go. Now imagine for just a minute you're standing there. You were there as Lazarus was dying. You were there when he died. You were there when they cleaned his body and wrapped him in the grave clothes. You were there when they carried his body out to the tomb, and probably the local priest came and did whatever it is local priests do in Judaism when people die. And you were there when they sealed the tomb. And you've been there now for 4 days, mourning with Mary and Martha, because they need you to be there. And so you know all of this. And now You see the dead man walk out of the tomb. So imagine what that must have been like. Imagine how surreal it must have been. And then imagine this, verse 45. Therefore, many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and had seen what Jesus did put their faith in him. Well, that reaction makes sense to me. That reaction is, my goodness, like the Roman soldier at the cross, after witnessing the events of the crucifixion, looks up at Jesus and said, truly this man was the Son of God. Truly, this man is who he says he is. And so some of them in the crowd standing there, seeing what Jesus did, said, truly, this man is the Messiah. Who's going to do anything greater than this? No one. And so they put their faith in him. But then look in verse 46. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And then look at the Pharisees' reactions. The Pharisees and the chief priests called a meeting. What are we accomplishing, they asked. Here's this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Here's my response to that. I want you to think about this. The same sun, talking about the big ball of fire in the sky, you know, that thing that affects the climate that nobody wants to give credit to. The big ball of fire in the sky, the same sun that softens the wax also hardens the clay. What's the difference in their reaction to the sun? The material is what's different. The nature of the material. The difference in the reactions of these people standing there was their heart. Because they had already refused to believe what they already knew, were hardened. There are none so blind as those who refuse to see. And that's where they were. They weren't going to believe no matter what. And remember, the Pharisees were guilty of the unpardonable sin. Why? Because they knew Jesus was the Messiah. They knew he fulfilled all the messianic prophecies. They knew he was the one that God had been promising them for millennia, and they rejected him because they didn't like him. They rejected him because he didn't say what they wanted him to say. They rejected him because he didn't do what they wanted him to do. So they rejected the only means of salvation that God was going to provide. So there was no hope for them. So some of these in the crowd see Jesus raise the dead. They see Lazarus come back to life. And their first response is to go run and tell the Pharisees what Jesus had done. And the Pharisees' response is to plot how to kill Jesus, to get him out of the way. So that brings me to this. You know, it's one thing to sit and look at the reactions of these people as they stood there and watched what Jesus did. But what about you? And here's the question that I want you to think about. What do you know to be true about this man Jesus? And then how have you responded to what you already know? Some of us sometimes, I think, ask God, Lord, why won't you answer this question for me? Why won't you show me this? Just show me this one thing, and then I'll have no trouble having complete confidence in you. I'll have no trouble trusting you if only you'll do this one thing. And therein is the answer to your question. You already refuse to believe what God has already demonstrated to you, and he's not going to give you more. God responds to our faith when we respond to whatever light we've already been given. And if you reject whatever light you've already been given, you're not going to get any more. And these people had rejected Jesus. They rejected him at his own testimony. They rejected him. Jesus even said to them, if you have difficulty with this, at least believe for the sake of the miracles. Jesus did the things that only the Messiah was going to do. You look through all the miracles in the Old Testament, and there were lots of miracles, but no one made the blind see. The Messiah was going to do that. What did Jesus do repeatedly? He made the blind to see. It was clear, it was evident who Jesus was, but many rejected him anyway. Jesus was drawing big crowds when he was feeding the thousands with just a few loaves of bread, and he drew big crowds when he healed the blind, and he healed the sick, and he raised the dead. And so people were following Jesus when they thought that they could get a free lunch and never be sick and never die. And then Jesus starts telling them hard things. You know what? The Son of Man doesn't have a place to lay his head. And if you're going to follow me, then you're going to have to deny yourself and forsake everything for my sake. And you're going to have to be obedient to me, even unto death. And you know what? People don't like me, or they're not going to like me soon, and then they're not going to like you. And you've got to be okay with that, because nothing can be more important to you than me. Not your parents, not your spouse, not your children. Nothing can be more important to you than I am. And if you're not okay with that, then I don't want you to follow me. And the crowd started to leave Jesus. You know, he didn't go to all the seminars that talked about church growth, because he didn't do it right. He didn't tell people, he didn't tickle their ears and tell them the things that they wanted to hear. He told them the hard truth, and the people rejected that. They hardened their hearts because they didn't like what Jesus had to say. So what do you already know to be true about this man Jesus, and how have you responded to what you already know? And then, related to that, what questions do you still have about Jesus? You know, I've been a follower of Jesus for a long time now, and I've studied his word intensely for a long time now. And I've followed Jesus in vocational ministry for a long time now. But, you know, there's still more that I don't know than what I do know. I mean, how could there not be? God is infinite, right? And I'm finite. And so if I could understand everything there was to understand about him and know everything there was to know, then he wouldn't be infinite, would he? I'd be able to put him in a box. So I can spend 1,000 lifetimes and still barely know him. I'll spend all of eternity. And I don't know if eternity is measured in days. That really doesn't make sense, but I don't know any other way to measure it. I'll spend day after day in eternity fellowshipping with him and loving him and knowing him and learning something new about him every single day. So what questions do you still have about Jesus? But then here's the kicker. Are you honestly seeking the answers? Because I don't know what your questions are. Maybe you're a mature saint who is in love with Jesus, and as you follow him, there are just questions that you are wrestling with and struggling with and want to know the answer to. Or maybe that's not you. Maybe you're a few links back, and you are back to the first question. You know some things about Jesus to be true, but you have not yet responded to those things, and you have some further questions. So the crucial question is, are you honestly seeking the answers to those questions? Or do you dismiss your quest for the truth at your own peril? You know, the rich young ruler came up to Jesus, and he was sincere. He wanted to have eternal life. He wanted to go to heaven when he died, and he recognized that there was something different about Jesus, and so he went up to Jesus and said, Lord, tell me how I can have eternal life. And so Jesus went through the first tablet of the law, and the young man said, oh, Lord, I've done all that. And so then Jesus said, well, there's one thing you lack. Sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and then come follow me. And it says that the young man, before that it says Jesus looked at him and loved him. So this wasn't someone Jesus was rejecting. This wasn't someone who had no opportunity to be saved. This wasn't someone who God had passed over and overlooked and was going through some meaningless exercise. It said Jesus looked at this young man and loved him, and he told him the truth. The young man's question was, Lord, how can I have eternal life? And the truth for that young man was, you have to get rid of everything that you own. Sell it all, give the money to the poor, and come follow me. Does that mean you earn your salvation by giving up all your stuff? No, it meant that this young man's heart was owned by his possessions, and Jesus knew that. And so in order for this young man to be able to give his heart to Jesus, he first had to have possession of his own heart. He had to get rid of his possessions and follow Jesus, and he wasn't willing to do it because he was rich. And nobody who's rich wants to be poor. Shoot, nobody who's poor wants to be poor. I just don't have a whole lot of choice. But he wasn't willing to do that. So he went away sad. And that's when Jesus said that it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to get into heaven, meaning the rich aren't willing to give up their comforts. They're not willing to sacrifice everything to Follow Jesus. Are you? Are you honestly seeking the answers to your question? Are you willing to follow those answers wherever they take you? Are you willing to forsake everything to follow Him? You dismiss your quest for the truth, like this young man did, at your own peril. You know what's sad? I personally, and I can't prove this biblically, so this is my own opinion, and you can disagree with me, and that's okay. I personally think that Nebuchadnezzar, the first king of the Babylonian Empire, a wicked, vile man who murdered hundreds of thousands of people, I personally believe that Nebuchadnezzar is in heaven today. As you read through the narrative, you see that through the testimony of Daniel, a captive who was in the employ of Nebuchadnezzar, you can see changes in Nebuchadnezzar throughout his reign. And you even see testimonies from Nebuchadnezzar, or what's the word I'm looking for, confessions of who God is from Nebuchadnezzar. So I think Nebuchadnezzar, in spite of his exceeding wickedness, will be in heaven for eternity because he saw God for who He was and accepted Him. And this young man, who by all accounts was a good young man, who tried to follow the law of God, will spend eternity separated from Him in hell forever because he wasn't willing to give up what he had to follow Jesus. Where are you? What do you already know about Jesus to be true? What questions do you have? Are you honestly seeking the truth?